You think you understand why the universe had a beginning. You don't. You believe the idea feels obvious because everything you know begins somewhere. Lives begin. Fires ignite. Stories start with a first page. You project this habit outward and assume the universe must obey the same logic. That assumption feels so natural that questioning it seems unnecessary, and that is precisely why it fails. The universe did not inherit its structure from your experience. Your experience inherited its limitations from the universe. Your confidence rests on a hidden premise, that a beginning is a moment inside time. A first event preceded by nothing, followed by everything. This feels coherent because time, to you, is already there. It is the container in which all things happen. You imagine the universe appearing inside it, like an object placed into an empty room. But the universe is not an object placed anywhere. It is the room. And once this is acknowledged, the idea of a beginning becomes unstable. Discomfort begins quietly. If time is part of the universe rather than something external to it, then the phrase "before the universe" loses meaning. Not mystery, meaning. You cannot place an event before the existence of the very dimension that defines what before is. Yet intuition resists this immediately. It insists there must have been something, some cause, some prior state, something waiting. This insistence does not come from evidence. It comes from habit. The contradiction sharpens when you recognize that the laws describing the universe stop functioning when you push them back toward the beginning. This is not because they fail. It is because the assumptions required to apply them disappear. Concepts like duration, sequence, and causation rely on a temporal framework. At the earliest boundary of the universe, that framework is no longer defined in the way your intuition demands. You are not facing a gap in knowledge. You are facing a boundary of applicability. At this point, many retreat to a familiar idea that the universe began because something caused it. This feels explanatory because causation is deeply ingrained in human reasoning. But causation itself assumes time. Causes precede effects. Remove temporal order, and causation loses coherence. Asking what caused the universe is like asking what lies north of the North Pole. The structure of the question presumes a dimension that does not extend beyond the boundary being described. The deeper mechanism becomes visible when you stop treating the beginning as an event and start treating it as a condition. The universe did not begin in time. Time is one of the things that emerged. The earliest state is not a moment after which things started happening. It is a limit where classical descriptions of time cease to apply. There is no first tick of a cosmic clock. There is no initial instant waiting to be counted. There is only a boundary where the concept of ticking no longer has meaning. This is profoundly unsettling because it dismantles the last refuge of intuition. You want the universe to behave like an extreme version of familiar processes. A bigger explosion, a denser object, a hotter fire. But the beginning is not an exaggerated event. It is a qualitative change in how description works. Near that boundary, space and time do not behave independently. The distinction you rely on collapses. Asking when it happened becomes as ill-defined as asking where a circle starts. Once this is understood, the idea of an eternal universe before the beginning no longer feels comforting or necessary. Eternity is just as dependent on time as beginnings are. An infinite past still requires a temporal dimension stretching backward without limit. If time itself emerges, then infinity before it is not an option, not forbidden, incoherent. The universe is not balancing between two possibilities. It is constrained by structure. The unavoidable conclusion begins to form without drama. The universe had a beginning, not because something forced it into existence, but because the description of reality includes a boundary where time as you understand it, does not extend. The beginning is not an event that happened. It is a condition beyond which the language of happening no longer applies. Your intuition fails because it expects reality to answer questions that only make sense inside the very framework being questioned. This is why explanations feel unsatisfying here. You are not being denied an answer. You are being shown that the question itself relies on assumptions the universe does not share. The universe does not owe you a cause that fits inside time when time itself is part of what is being explained. It remains consistent even when that consistency feels hostile to understanding. If the universe did not begin as an event in time, but as a boundary where time itself becomes undefined, which part of your certainty about beginnings feels hardest to abandon now? The initial conclusion feels final only because intuition has not yet exhausted its defenses. A new assumption quickly takes its place, that even if time emerged at the beginning, there must still be a deeper explanation waiting underneath. Something more fundamental that restores causality, sequence, and origin in a form that feels complete. This expectation is not scientific, it is psychological. It reflects a belief that explanation must eventually align with human expectation. The universe has never agreed to this condition. Discomfort deepens when you recognize that the beginning is not merely distant, but inaccessible in principle. Not because it is hidden behind insufficient data, but because the tools you rely on lose meaning there. When time ceases to behave as an independent dimension, questions framed in temporal language become invalid. This is not a failure of knowledge. It is a failure of intuition to recognize its own limits. You may still imagine the beginning as an extreme state of density or temperature compressed into a point. This image persists because it feels concrete. But concreteness here is misleading. Density requires volume. Temperature requires time for interaction. Both rely on spatial and temporal separation. Near the beginning, those separations dissolve. What remains is not an object, not a moment, not a singular event, but a boundary condition on the geometry of space-time itself. This produces a contradiction that intuition struggles to resolve. If the beginning is not an event, then it cannot be located within a sequence, yet everything you have ever experienced exists within a sequence. The mind resists accepting a reality that does not resemble experience. It tries to force the boundary into a narrative. It asks what happened first, then what happened next. But the boundary does not permit ordering. It is not the first page of a story. It is the edge of the book. The deeper mechanism becomes clearer when you consider how laws of physics depend on smoothness. They assume continuity, small changes, predictable relations. Near the beginning, these assumptions fail, not because the laws break, but because the conditions required for their application are absent. The universe does not violate its own rules. It simply does not extend them beyond where they make sense. This is why attempts to describe the beginning using ordinary time inevitably collapse into paradox. If time slows infinitely as you approach the boundary, then the notion of reaching it already assumes a clock that continues to tick. If time dissolves entirely, then reaching loses meaning. Either way, intuition is denied what it seeks, a moment that can be pointed to and labeled as the start. Another defense often appears here. You may think the universe began from a prior state governed by different laws, a pre-existing realm, a timeless cause. This idea feels flexible because it avoids a sharp boundary, but it fails for the same reason. Any prior state that can be described is already part of a structure that includes time, relation, and sequence. Pushing the explanation back does not remove the boundary. It relocates it. The question remains unchanged. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. The beginning is not something that can be explained away by deeper layers. It is a limit to explanation itself. The universe does not conceal its origin behind complexity. It exposes it as a point where your demand for cause and sequence no longer applies. You are not meant to resolve it into familiarity. You are meant to recognize it as a boundary. Once this is accepted, the discomfort intensifies rather than fades. You are forced to abandon the idea that the universe owes you a narrative origin. It does not begin in the way stories begin. It does not require a trigger. It does not need permission to exist. These are human expectations projected outward. The universe remains structurally indifferent to them. The unavoidable conclusion grows more precise. The universe had a beginning because space-time itself includes a boundary, not a starting gun, not an explosion waiting in time. A boundary beyond which the concepts that define before and cause do not extend. This is not an answer that satisfies intuition. It is one that terminates it. If explanation ends where intuition can no longer operate, then what exactly are you expecting reality to provide when you demand a cause for the universe itself? The resistance that remains now is subtle, but it is decisive. Even after accepting that the beginning is a boundary rather than an event, you may still believe that boundaries are temporary stand-ins for ignorance. That with enough progress, enough refinement, the universe will eventually yield a deeper explanation that restores continuity. This belief feels reasonable because it has worked before. Many boundaries in science were once mistaken for limits, only to dissolve under better understanding. But this one behaves differently. It does not recede when examined. It becomes sharper. The discomfort intensifies when you realize that the beginning is not hiding behind complexity. It is not concealed by insufficient data or immature theory. It is exposed precisely because the structure of space-time is taken seriously. The more accurately you describe the universe, the less room there is for intuition to survive. The beginning does not blur into uncertainty. It crystallizes into a statement about what can and cannot be meaningfully asked. At this depth, the contradiction becomes unavoidable. You want the universe to explain itself in terms of causes because causation is how you navigate the world. But causation is a relational concept that operates inside space-time, not outside it. To demand a cause for space-time itself is to apply a rule beyond the domain where it functions. This is not an unanswered question. It is an invalid one. The universe does not refuse to answer. It renders the demand meaningless. The deeper mechanism reveals why this boundary is unavoidable. Space-time is not assembled from smaller temporal pieces. It is not stitched together moment by moment. It is a complete geometric structure. Asking what came before it assumes that the structure can be extended. But extension requires the very dimension whose emergence you are trying to explain. The logic collapses under its own assumptions. This is why even the most refined descriptions stop short of describing a first moment. There is no first moment to describe. There is no temporal coordinate that marks the beginning as an interior point. The boundary is not part of the timeline. It is where the timeline ends. Trying to step beyond it is not exploration. It is a category error. This realization unsettles another deeply held belief that reality must be grounded in something prior, that existence itself requires justification. The universe does not provide one, not because it is mysterious, but because justification is a concept that operates within existence, not underneath it. The demand for an external reason reflects a human discomfort with brute structure. The universe does not share this discomfort. At this point, intuition often retreats to abstraction. Perhaps the universe exists because of necessity. Perhaps it is the only consistent structure. Perhaps no alternative is possible. These ideas feel explanatory because they replace narrative with inevitability. But even here, caution is required. Necessity does not restore cause. It removes it. It does not tell you why the universe began. It tells you that asking why is misplaced. The boundary at the beginning is therefore not a flaw in explanation, it is the end point of it. Beyond that point, explanation no longer increases understanding. It degrades it by importing concepts that do not apply. The universe remains coherent, precisely because it does not extend beyond what can be consistently described. This leads to a conclusion that intuition finds deeply uncomfortable. The universe does not begin in the way things begin within it. It simply includes a boundary where description stops. There is no hidden mechanism waiting to be uncovered that will make this feel intuitive. The discomfort is not temporary. It is structural. Once this is seen, the beginning stops feeling like a mystery to be solved and starts feeling like a limit to be respected. Not a wall hiding answers, but a horizon beyond which questions lose meaning. The universe is not incomplete without a cause for itself. It is complete without one. If explanation reaches a point where adding more why only produces confusion, how certain are you that the universe owes you a reason for its own existence? What remains now is not a missing piece, but a final refusal of comfort. Even after accepting that the universe has a boundary where time and causation cease to apply, you may still believe that this boundary is provisional. That explanation, by its nature, must eventually extend beyond it. This belief is not grounded in evidence. It is grounded in expectation. You expect reality to behave like a problem that can always be solved if you persist long enough. The universe does not operate under that obligation. At this point, the beginning reveals its true significance. It is not important because it marks where everything started. It is important because it marks where explanation stops being additive. Beyond it, adding more concepts does not clarify reality. It distorts it. The demand for a cause, a prior state, or an external reason does not deepen understanding. It reintroduces assumptions that the structure of the universe has already invalidated. This is the final contradiction intuition must face. You have learned to trust explanation because within the universe it works. Causes lead to effects, conditions produce outcomes. But the universe itself is not one more object inside this chain. It is the chain. Asking for its cause is like asking for the cause of causation. The question folds back on itself and loses coherence, not because the answer is hidden, but because the question assumes what it is trying to explain. The deeper mechanism is now unavoidable. The universe is not something that happens, it is something that is. Time, sequence, and origin are internal features, not external requirements. The beginning is not a failure of explanation. It is the point at which explanation reveals its own limits. The universe remains consistent even when your intuition can no longer follow. This is why the beginning feels so unsettling. It denies you the reassurance that everything must fit into a familiar pattern. It shows you that reality does not need to justify itself in the way events within it do. The universe does not emerge from nothing in time. It includes a boundary where the distinction between something and nothing, before and after, ceases to be well defined. Once this is fully understood, the question, why did the universe begin, quietly dissolves. Not because it has been answered, but because you can now see that it was built on assumptions the universe does not share. What remains is not ignorance, but restraint. An acknowledgement that some demands for explanation exceed the domain where explanation is meaningful. The unavoidable conclusion stands without embellishment. The universe had a beginning because its structure includes a boundary beyond which time does not extend. There is no deeper story waiting behind it, no hidden cause to be uncovered. Reality does not become incomplete because of this. It becomes precise. After reaching this point, the final question is no longer about the universe. It is about you. If reality remains coherent without providing a cause for its own existence, what does that imply about your expectation that everything must ultimately make intuitive sense?